want to talk about a web that existed earlier on and how we might be able to get back to that web. So who in here remembers any of these websites? So GeoCities was pretty fantastic. You could make your own website and it would look really crappy or really great, and you had 5 megabytes to do that in. LavaBit did emails. MySpace became a zombie company where it just kind of keeps existing forever and ever. And I'm sure that if anybody opens up their old profile, some dusty server somewhere in some data center is like spinning up and people are cheering or something like that. Upcoming.org was a really wonderful event site that I know a lot of you probably used in Portland, made by Andy Baio, who's from here. Posterous was pretty cool, or Posterous if you want to get intense on how to pronounce a web term. And then Goala was pretty cool, and of course all of these kind of just shut down. The big thing about all of these is that they all had your data in them. MySpace had blogs and photos, and Upcoming.org had all your event details. Posterous had some sort of information that you put into it. All of them contained your personal data. Goala had location data. And the problem was that when they died, some of them didn't provide a data export and some of them did. But there's no way to really guarantee. And when I was talking to a lot of people about acquisitions, some companies actually say, well, let's not do a data export because keeping people's data in the system and not allowing them to get it out would actually bump up the purchase price. And so some people are incentivized not to allow people to get their data out of the system. Now, this is completely varied across acquisitions and across shutdowns and across companies just running out of money and saying we have to just, we're done. But the main thing is that it's completely unpredictable. So most of your sites that you use right now will have a half-life. You'll put your data into them and your data will be gone at some point. So AOL Hometown is a site where this was something like GeoCities. You could put all your personal data into it on web pages. It was really easy to use. And when they shut down, there was no data export. Posterous, there was data export, so that wasn't as horrible of a thing. I can show you some information about this. This is actually, so AOL Hometown, instead of saying to people, hey, we're going to shut down your site, or we're just going to disable this and send an email to every AOL home site user, they put it up on AOLhomesites.com. And of course no one goes there because they made a website as a memorial for the death of their 12-year-old son, or boating adventures pictures, or wedding pictures, and they had no other copy of that data. And of course they don't go to AOLhomesites.com every day to see if there's new news and updates about AOL home sites. They just don't go there. So it's like the equivalent of putting a notice that your plant is going to be destroyed in an unused lavatory with a sign that says beware of the leopard or anything like that. So these are some of the examples. My favorite one is, what a shambles and a poor show. No one wants to know either. Fortunately, I saved my webpage and transferred it to GeoCities, which of course a few years later was shut down. Somebody was like, can I retrieve my old homepage? How do I get my files back? People noticed, but they noticed late, as in 2 weeks late, or 3 weeks late, or months late. And there was this giant thread on AOL home sites. It was like, hey, we're shutting down, da-da-da, and 400 comments. And then oh, there are too many comments. And so corporate was like, let's shut off the comments instead of actually trying to fix the problem. This has happened again and again. Now, eventually people are going to be burned a lot of times, because we're talking about, most of you guys are probably tech savvy. You have a copy of your own data saved somewhere. Maybe you have your own web domain, and a lot of people don't. So as people get burned again and again and again by their data evaporating, they'll probably, hopefully, figure out some way to do it, or maybe not. And the reason why I say maybe not is because people are really busy, and unless you're in tech, you might not care or have the time to deal with the management of all this stuff and all your data. You just want a service that works. So welcome to the siloed web, I guess. There's places for all of your different bits and bytes, right? There's places for your location data, there's places for your blog data. There's even a templated profile self on Facebook that you fill in that says, here's your photo, here's your interests, here's your likes. There's not really a lot of creativity that you can put into it, which is why it's kind of useful, because you can't put automatically loading sound files and videos and things like that. So it's been a bit standardized just for loading and things like that. But the issue is that we're all basically sharecropping on the web. We are giving our stuff to absentee landowners, and in order to have this free space in which to plant our crops or our data, there's a tax that's taken. And so this sharecropping is that we don't really own this land, this virtual estate that we are farming on, and somebody else gets the products from it. This is not bad or good, it's just the way it is, right? So there are benefits to it and there are deficits. One of the benefits is that somebody else maintains your user interface, somebody else maintains the servers, it's free, and everybody you know is probably there. And it really reduces the friction to communicating with people. The deficits, of course, are that somebody else owns your data, they can change the user interface at any time, they can shut down the service, they can use your data in some way, and you don't have control over it. So an example of changing user interfaces, this was my favorite version of the Twitter interface. It loaded really fast, there wasn't 3 megabytes of JavaScript loading in the browser so that I couldn't get to my data. I could say, what am I doing, 140 characters, it's done. It was really simple because there just wasn't much there, and you could easily see your friends. It was just nice. But I had no control over the user interface, and over time, the Twitter API was shut off to most people except if you were grandfathered in from like 2008 or something like that. So you had this issue where Twitter originally was this almost utopian style service. I thought that Twitter would create the Internet of Things. Because people were hooking up trees to Twitter, where if you hugged the tree, it would tweet and be like, I was hugged 3 times today. Or people were hooking up cows to Twitter, so when they were milked, I produced this much. And then there were people who even were connecting beds to Twitter of newlyweds and as pranks. Anyway, the idea is that people were playing with the service and having fun. And anytime you have a service in which people try to game the system or play with it or make weird stuff, the prototypical example being the iPhone and the Whoopee Cushion app, that's going to be a very adopted platform. Now, what Twitter did, which was really smart, it said, here's the API. If you don't like our interface, make a better one yourself, and you can allow people to access Twitter through this. So people made all these great things like EchoPhone and TweetDeck and all these third-party interfaces. And then when Twitter shut that down and said, you can't make all these interfaces anymore, you're stuck with the interface that they wanted you to use. And it was really frustrating because a lot of people are better and faster at making these better interfaces because they're using them and they really care, and maybe they have some free time and they don't have to, now as Twitter's really large, they don't have to go to like 10 manager meetings in order to get approval to change a button, right? So that's one of the issues of the siloed web. And Chris Messina gave this talk at Open Source Bridge in 2009 about social network supermarkets. He said that early on, kind of the history of humanity is that, maybe when you were a cave person, you'd you'd go into a cave and you'd get all the wild animals out of it, and you'd have this home, and that would be like your safety need. You'd build a fire and you'd eat some food, and that was great. And then you had a little tribe which satisfied your belonging needs, and then your esteem needs were, if you do really well and hunt the most buffalo or whatever hunting at that period of time, then you have great self-esteem. And maybe you can't get to self-actualization before then, but a lot of it is doing it yourself, right? Now you don't get the benefits of standardized healthcare, for instance, or or the modern medicine, or if you get a toothache, you could probably die. There are issues with that. But Chris Messina talked about how we're going up this list in terms of modern society. Now you rent your house with a mortgage. You don't really own it. A mortgage is, somebody else kind of owns it, and you own it, and you pay for it. And the same with land, even, you pay tax on it. And that provides your safety needs, your physiological needs, having to eat. You go to the supermarket and you buy food. You don't grow your food as much anymore. You belong to something, maybe you get a gym membership and maybe you work at a company, but that's your belonging needs. You have a family, but maybe they're somewhere else. And so you use Facebook to connect with them. And so our identity then becomes also sharecropped by this third-party entity. Now you're renting your identity from a third party on Facebook or Twitter or wherever you're hosting your identity, right? So this becomes this Maslow's hierarchy. So now is it that your self-actualization will be owned by a third party? Is that bad or good? Well, on the one hand, it might make it easier to be self-actualized. And I'm not saying that any of these are good or bad, but there are trade-offs. So where do these trade-offs come from, and really what's the history of how we got here? So really there's something that I've tried to pinpoint it down and talk with a lot of people about this, including Tantek Celik, who's been on a lot of these groups and watched. So something happened in 2003. So in 2003, Maybe a lot of you were on Slashdot, maybe some of you were on Boing Boing, maybe some of you hated them and didn't want to be on them because you thought they were really addicting. But in 2003, there was this very playful web, especially like 1997 to 2002. People were making these things that weren't really called blogs, but they were a site where there was some updates. You were handcrafting whatever your identity was online. South by Southwest was, everybody was known by their address online. It was just, okay, I'm, adactio.com, or, I'm a caseorganic.com, whatever your web domain was. And people knew each other for their website, as in people knew each other for what they produced. And people really learned how to program and do web development through making these little blogs and these little websites, and they experimented, and some people were like, well, if you click here, you can change the style sheet applied to my site, and be, oh, that's really cool. And they look at the source code and they copy it, oh, cool, I have that on my site, but what if I did this instead? It was just this fun, playful thing, and they'd all hang out with each other like that. And then RSS and Atom showed up, and that was amazing, because suddenly you could subscribe to any of this content. And then there were all these other systems, especially in 2006, there was a whole bunch of them where you could cut out pieces of somebody's site and subscribe to just that part if they didn't have an RSS feed. And this goes back to why I thought Twitter was going to be an enabler of the Internet of Things, because Twitter gave everything an RSS feed, and you could easily format whatever you wanted into Twitter and subscribe to it. And then you could remix it with something like, this is silly, something like Yahoo Pipes or something like that, where you could take it. So you didn't technically have to be able to program to do it. And this was really interesting. So I thought that if you could do all of that, you could connect everything. Of course, Twitter became less about RSS, and the world became less about RSS and Atom. And then WordPress came out in 2003. And this really changed a lot of things. I remember WordPress coming out, I downloaded it, installed it on my server, whoa! Mostly I was just jealous of the person because he came up with a really great name. I thought it was like the evolution of the printing press and Microsoft Word together at last, where you could publish documents. Anyway, it ended up being just that. The people who might have used Microsoft Word to write their documents could then suddenly blog. And they didn't have to do something from scratch. And yeah, it was a mess, and yeah, you had to edit PHP all the time in order to install a plugin and then upgrade it, but it was really amazing at that point in time. And people started to really learn with that, but they weren't learning from making something from scratch as much anymore, but they were hacking a lot and building new plugins and screwing with things, and that was really playful and fun. But then something started to happen. In 2003, this fight started. All these really, really intelligent people got on these mailing lists to determine the future of RSS and Atom. Instead of saying, okay, there's two methods that you can use to subscribe to content, they kind of just fought. Which is better, RSS or Atom? It was a lot of time that a lot of people took up, and they got engaged in this kind of managerial, bureaucratic battle. So I call them the RSS Atom Wars. So during that time, when everybody was distracted over here in these mailing lists, the rise of social networks happened. So with Friendster kind of starting up the whole thing in 2002, to MySpace and Facebook and Twitter, basically what these did is said, okay, instead of subscribing to some content on somebody's site, we're going to integrate both the RSS feed and the user interface into one thing, and we're going to make a social network so that everybody has your identity and an RSS feed, and you can subscribe to it and get it all in one page in your own user interface. So I log in, I get all the RSS feeds of people instead of their content. It's just they publish, and it's short form, and I get it, right? And so this was, whoa, this is much easier than installing blogging software on my own domain and posting stuff that's long form. I can just put in my templated self, my identity, and get everybody's information. So people who generally were not software developers, and even were software developers just because they wanted quick access to information, just started joining up. And this started just changing the fabric of how we consume the internet. It was a single UI and a subscription model, and just one click, or maybe a little form fills, and ding. So meanwhile, there were things being experimented with, and they were in the primordial state on WordPress and some of these social networks. And one of those was the pingback. This was a really, if you think about if I'm on Instagram and I mention somebody, that's basically the equivalent of what a pingback could be. Hey, I'm basically saying, hey, look at this post, right? So pingback was kind of like that. It's like, hey, I linked to your post right here. But again, this didn't really get taken up. This was not something that people liked. In fact, it got drafted, and then it got implemented, and then it kind of fell off. And you could see that it fell off at some point because it started to be used by spammers. So this is an example of pingback from even a Mozilla blog. So you can see that somebody posted something that linked to a Mozilla blog, and it goes ... excerpt, URL, date, ... Totally useless. It didn't say anything about why that post was interesting, right? So there's just, this is a machine-made thing. There was no curation involved in it. And so these just became spam. From the same blog post, I was able to just go down and, you'd have all this, if you manage a WordPress blog, you'd have, and 300 pingbacks. And so WordPress learned, well, we'll just compress these because pingbacks are awful, and pingbacks were just not useful. But that was the thing that was supposed to enable like this whole social blog web where you had your own identity on your own blog, and you could mention people, and they could mention you, and you could subscribe to their updates, and they could subscribe to your updates. Like, imagine you administrating your own blog and having everybody comment on their own site and being able to see it on your site. So you never have to leave your site, and you can get all this information. And that's what social networks did. So people just went there. So personal sites started to really decline, and we're seeing them decline even more. Like, I have a blog, and I still find it really hard to post. And unless you're a professional blogger or you have a 4-hour chunk of time, then it's really hard to blog. There are a few people who blog really well still, and there will always be, but it's been on the decline ever since. And RSS and Atom have faded out a lot. And then when Google Reader shut down, that was really a big deal. Okay, fine, this is done for a lot of people. So the state of blogs today, there's really not a lot of personal activity. WordPress is really heavy for across corporations, and people use it, and it's great. But now people are kind of turning to these kind of GitHub hosted blogs, and then there's a lot of Medium posts for like the front page of Hacker News. And I guess this is what it's like on the internet. I always feel like I just tab over to Reddit and just read that instead of writing my blog post for like 8 hours, and then I get nothing done. So I just kind of decided to blog less because of that. What's basically happened, and this is the biggest issue, is that it's become way easier to consume than to create, where the value, the build-up time, the understanding of how long it takes to make something really great is kind of overshadowed by the fact that you can just consume it in a few seconds, and it's much easier to just get the dopamine hit of just consuming something on Facebook or Reddit or Hacker News or whatever you use. And this is really sad because I think a lot of us, especially like if we've done anything in web development, we like to create, and that's what we're doing. And unless there's a special place like a company that we can create at, or we're incentivized monetarily, or there's a group or there's a hackathon on the side, it's really hard to be self-motivated to create anymore. And I think there were these pockets like a sine wave where the internet was new, and let's do our own personal websites, and let's learn from each other, and then things get really commodified, and then people get really busy, and then everything goes down again, and then people have free time and they can build up again. I think we're at the top of one of those again, where we're all really busy and we don't have enough time to do it, and learning really goes down and creating really goes down during that time. So, terms of service didn't read. I really think that if you look at some of these places where it's really easy to write a post on Medium because it's hosted and the user interface is great, or if you're a fan of something, you want to make a Wikia, kind of Wikimedia style fan community. I have a friend who quit Wikia because Wikia just owns all of the fan created data, and you can't transfer it off their site according to the terms of service. So basically you can create this amazing thing, and there's a bunch of ads on it, and you can't take it anywhere. So when your group decides to leave, you can't leave. So maybe you had like the coolest Harry Potter fan site in the world, and you can't take it anywhere. Medium, you can, even if this company gets acquired, they can use your name, your content at any time. So they could just publish it into a bunch of books and put your name on it and make money off of it. Not that they're going to do that, it's just that it takes a long time to read terms of service, and it's important to figure this stuff out. So back to 2003. What should have happened, or what could have happened in 2003 instead? So personal blogs, instead of being in the RSS and Atom wars, would just move forward. And your own personal site would be able to subscribe to other sites through its user interface so that you could comment on the people that you're subscribing to. But at the end of the day, you would own that. So maybe there would be a blogging framework that you would install on your server with one click through HostMonster or whatever and configure it. And then you could click on somebody else's blog on the web and hit follow in the same way that you would click on an RSS feed. And that would show up in your feed on your own site with your own user experience. And then you could comment there. The great thing about that is all the comments get stored on your site instead of somebody else's site. You know, you've probably commented on plenty of sites and the comment just gets lost forever. Even if you use Disqus, you're not going to log in and be like, here's all my comments. They don't stay anywhere. They're staying in a third-party system. And there wouldn't be like these silo things. Basically, your site would be able to handle all of the information that you gather throughout the day. So, for instance, your location data check-ins like Foursquare, they would go to your site first, and then they would go out to Foursquare if you wanted to use that interface or the amount of people there. So here's why it couldn't happen in 2003, I guess. And this is this is what I'm kind of thinking of. But between 2003 and 2013 is that it was not really feasible to do short status updates. People were still of the mind that you had to do like at least a few paragraphs or it wasn't reasonable. And so between that, now we have short status updates as a totally feasible form of content. And there's a few other little things, but really the RSS atom wars got in the way of people moving forward, experimenting with their sites and really consolidating. All those really smart people got frustrated and then left for larger social network companies. So how can we pick up from where 2003 left off? And this is like a longer term project, like 3 to 10 years, right? But we need a way to own our data because we're going to keep dealing with these sites that they're really, really great as the community builds up around a site, and then the site's investors are going to say, well, you need to do a redesign, or your company needs to IPO, or your company is getting acquired, and then you get shut down. And your data is not there anymore. So we need a way to own our data, first off. It'd be great if we owned things like our health data so that we could share it with doctors and have a whole OAuth protocol where you could say, I'm going to share my data with my doctor for 24 hours, and then it will expire. And then my doctor doesn't have to say, well, you need an extra set of x-rays because we can't get it transferred over from this firm because we need to make more money or something like that. But there are lots of issues where if you just had your own data and your own repository, you would never, I mean, in Star Trek you have like a personal data file, right? Like this is pretty much that same thing. You've got all your different stuff in a data file and it's yours. And you actually own it. And you're letting a third party use it for a temporary period of time in order to get a service. Right? It should be you negotiating that access instead of them saying, well, we just have access to it and it's owned by somebody else and then it changes hands. And then we need to be able to really improve on what we're doing and play and enjoy the web and just implement something. It doesn't have to be perfect. So these guys are pretty awesome. Blaine Cook and Ralph Major. Blaine was one of the earliest engineers on Twitter. His story is not very often told. He was the one responsible for making it so that you could follow en masse people like celebrities on Twitter, something that he just implemented without really telling a lot of people. He's like, oh, I think this should happen, and implemented it, and that really changed what Twitter became. So in a way, he's both responsible for Twitter becoming this like media machine and responsible for helping to bring it to life. So I kind of 50% I'm annoyed with him for taking away from what it could have been with the Internet of Things, and on the other hand, I think it's great that he helped birth this thing. So these guys went to this thing called Social Web Food Camp, which is an O'Reilly thing. You go to O'Reilly's office and you sleep underneath the cubicles in a sleeping bag, and all day long you like build stuff. So these guys stayed up all night and they said, well, we're going to try and have Twitter talk to Jaiku, which of course was very difficult because they both speak different languages. They said, I want to use Twitter and I want to talk to this guy who has a Jaiku account, and then I want to get him to reply to me via Jaiku, and I want to get the reply inside Twitter. As in, I want to use the site that I like, which is Twitter, and I want to get the reply inside Twitter and not even care or know that he uses Jaiku, and he wants to get all that information through Jaiku. So basically, you use the social network you like, you use the interface you like, but yet you can cross, right? So this is kind of a dream, right? Because we're basically kind of in a Tower of Babel situation. We have all these social networks that don't speak the same language. We have all these data feeds that don't speak the same language. So this is what they did, and you could say, hey, I'm talking to Blaine from Jaiku, and it would show up there and he didn't have to leave the interface. So then people got really excited about this again, and they made this thing called Federated Social Web Summit. This was in Portland, Oregon. A lot of the diaspora people were there. It was really interesting, except that nothing got done. It later got wrapped into a W3C community, which is just all talk and no action. I really hate, sorry. Basically, let's write a spec, and let's do a mailing list, and let's do this thing, and oh, what about this idea, right? It's just all this hand waving, and so the pictures from this are everybody being really serious. There's Aaron being really serious, and there's Chris Messina behind him being really serious. The whole thing was really frustrating. So people started breaking off from this group, and they sat, Aaron Preggy and Tontek Chelik were mad about this. They said, okay, we just need to do something, let's implement something. And they sat down, they said, well, how about something called the IndieWeb, where it's independent, let's just make a name. And the whole point of this is you implement something and you show it to the community. So you show and you don't tell. So whoever has the best story doesn't win, whoever has the best implementation wins, but everybody can have their own implementation and use the code and things like that. And if you think about, oh, I'm going to design a protocol, like you don't sit down and say, I'm going to design the perfect protocol that everyone will then adopt. That doesn't happen. You say, oh, I designed this thing to fix my problem, and then everybody adopts it, like MIDI or the mouse. Like the guy who invented the mouse was like, here's a temporary way to interact with your data until we can touch the screen and actually interact with it. And 60 years later, at age 90, he's like, I can't believe you guys are still using the mouse. So this is kind of the same thing. You don't say, let's make a bunch of specs and have a W3C working community to figure out the best perfect thing. You can't create a perfect thing. That's a Platonic ideal. You have to make this like, whatever, you have to satisfy us and make something that just bridges that gap just a little bit so that something can happen. So these guys said, let's do this. And then we said, well, we have to get all these people together. And so we all sat down and we said, okay, let's just do this thing called IndieWeb Camp. It'll be the same thing as Federated Social Web with pretty much the same people, but you have to actually build something. And and the number one thing you have to do is you have to have your own domain in order to sign into the website. And so if you didn't have your own domain, you could talk all you wanted to, but you had to show at least that you were dedicated to the cause of owning your own data, right? So people would complain, oh, I'm so mad, I have to have my own domain name in order to log into your site to RSVP. And we're like, well, it takes 15 minutes. And you're like a web developer, you have no excuse. And so that automatically filtered out anybody who didn't want to do just the iota of work, which basically was like, okay, these people are very interested in talking, but they don't implement. And that was very strict, kind of joke strict, but it basically set the tone. So the purpose was show, don't tell. And you have to be a creator of something. It doesn't really matter what, but you have to have written something, or at least show that you have something running on your own site. And originally we had a MediaWiki site with OpenID and domain name. So enter the IndieWeb. Well, the thing is, with a community like this, you don't just say, okay, now it's the IndieWeb, now it's Web 2.0. It's an emergent thing. You can't say, okay, now is the era of X. It has to slowly emerge. 5 people do this, and then 10 people, and then 200 people, where it's in symbiotic relationship with its environment. Otherwise, it gets really brittle and just dies, or too much funding and falls over, or too many people use it and it doesn't work, or there's unreasonable expectations for it. So this was our IndieWeb camp. People flew in from all over the place. Well, not too many all over the place, but this is a kind of an eclectic group at Urban Airship in 2011. You probably recognize a few of these guys. Then in 2012, we said, we're going to have this thing called IndieAuth. It's basically like an authentication provider where you use your own website to log in, and you could only add yourself to the attendee list if you used your domain name to log into the site and edit. And so everything was basically edited there. And what you do is just get your own domain and put a RailMe on it, and then you could do it. It was really quite simple, right? But you had to have your own domain name and edit something. And so that caused more uproar. Oh, this is harder to do than last year. It's like, you're a web developer, do it. This is not a big deal. This is 15 minutes. There were some errors, so it's like, well, here's GitHub, and tell us that it's wrong and contribute. So it's emergent. But the number one thing we had to decide is not to have any mailing lists. because there are some issues with mailing lists. Blaine talked about when storytelling is told by people and not by traction, then whoever tells the best story wins. And if you've ever worked in a large company and you're at a meeting of like 15 people, whoever just talks the best, even though the thing could be completely BS, usually, oh yeah, I agree, versus here I built this thing, sends it over IRC, oh cool, that's a great thing, let's implement it, here's the code, right? There's a way big difference between the two. And so you have these channels that are often dominated by somebody who tells a really good story on a mailing list versus somebody who implements. And also, when you look at a mailing list, this is disgusting, like I hate this. Look at this waste of space. The header is giant. Every time you read a message from this group, you're scrolling through the header, and then actually from this message, it's just like, this person is just whining, this is pointless, and then there's like a little thing at the bottom that's like, this is dumb, and they don't really explain why, and they're just kind of bitching. It's horrible, it's awful. Versus, like, look at the resolution that you can get of discussion through using IRC. And this is people in all different time zones. And there's this little friendly bot in the channel named Loki where you can say the tell command, like exclamation point tell. So if somebody is in Iceland and you're in Portland and they're not awake yet, you can say tell. And when they get online, they get a message delivered to them in IRC. It's just so much better. So we decided we'd only do that and we'd have a wiki. And so that really helped people, because you can't really whine on a wiki because it takes a lot of time to edit a wiki. So you can't just hit reply, I'm mad and I drank too much beer. I'm sitting in a very contemplative mental form, and I'm going to put some MediaWiki markup with some bullet points of things that we need to do. Okay, great, and I'm going to turn these bullet points into web pages by putting brackets around them and then clicking on them, and then you can make, just the way that the interface allows you to interact with people is completely different. So we said, well, let's change the architecture and then people will interact differently with each other. And that worked out really well. You can join this channel. It's in Freenode. It's just #IndieWebCamp, and there's just happy people in there all the time that are willing to like send you links to the MediaWiki and say, here you go, here's some guidelines, and they'll help you through the whole thing. It's just the friendliest channel you could be in. Versus this, which is just like, rah, who are you? And sorry. So principles. So we set these principles down as here are things to think about when designing the IndieWeb. One is called posse. The whole idea is that you publish on your own site and then you syndicate elsewhere. So how do you own your own data? Well, publish on your own site, but you can use the power of a third party with the distribution channel. Say you have 13,000 followers on Twitter, you still get the benefit of having 13,000 people on that social network, but you own the data first. So if Twitter shuts down or moves or changes, you still own the content on your own site with a date and timestamp. So that's posse. Most APIs allow you to posse. They allow you to post your content and then have your server say, hey, to the third party, here's some data. And then they say, okay, great, I'll post it. The opposite, which is Band-Aid, basically, it's if you can't syndicate elsewhere and post on your own domain, you can publish elsewhere and syndicate to your own site. So you can basically say, okay, I'm going to post it to Twitter, and then my server is going to have a little cron job that says, okay, there's some new data, and it posts it over to your site afterwards. So that's the opposite, and that's basically a backup. Here's the other problem. If you've ever gone to a site and you see all these share buttons, it's just really annoying because you don't really need them. Basically, some people use some websites and some people use other websites, and just like on Android where you have an intent and you say, oh, I'm going to hit the share button, and it loads the apps that are installed on your phone, right? It doesn't load the apps that aren't installed on your phone. It just loads, maybe you use 3 social networks. It loads Facebook and Twitter and MySpace or whatever, and then they're there, right? So the share button should act a lot more like an intent. It should say, what social networks do you use and have an account on and use most frequently? Okay, these 3, and then it pops up. So every site can have a share button or a reply button. Every single piece of content on the web could have those buttons. And then you could hit reply, and it would post a copy of that to your site, and you could reply to it if you wanted to. Or you could hit share, and it would allow you to share from your site, and then have a little edit field and say, and also share back to these third parties, right? So you basically, there aren't that many actions. You only need to favorite something, comment on something, reply to something, through a mention if you want to mention something, and then RSVP in the case of an event. That's really all there is. Not this. This doesn't make any sense. So you have this fragmentation that's been going on. And it's really hot in here, I apologize. So this guy, Sandeep Shetty, said, I want to mention somebody from my own site, and they should be able to receive it. Really basic. So he made this thing called web mention, which you can actually use on your own domain. And it was really simple. So all the people who use IndieWeb principles can talk to each other from their own website now. And then it shows up. It was really simple. So then we have the other problem that has been unsolved, which is pingbacks, right? Pingbacks, not very useful, uses spam. This is the original pingback display, ... content, timestamp, URL, totally machine readable, totally not human readable. The web should be human readable. There's plenty that can be read by machines in the background. So here's a web mention display. We're trying to get to the goat field during a conference. So I mentioned Ben Ward, who on his site posted a picture of baby goats, and I said, mention it at Ward. This is on my own domain. How did you get to pet the baby goats? I put a hashtag, and he saw it on his own site. He's like, oh, cool. And he replied on his own site to my note and said, there's a gate, go here. I got that reply immediately, and I went, baby goats, yay. But the whole point behind this is that I controlled the experience for my own site, and so did he. And web mention worked like that. Here's another example. We built a system called IndieWeb Event RSVP. So if you want to have, at this point, an IndieWeb meetup, you can just say, here's the event, here's the time, it's all micro formats. So here's the problem when you're on the web. You try to search for events, but usually the stuff with the highest page rank shows up. So, hey, stuff to do in Portland this weekend. It doesn't search for stuff to do in Portland this weekend. It has stuff from 2008 or 2007 with a really high page rank because somebody else linked to it a long time ago. With micro formats, you can tag your events to actually show up in search engines properly, so you can actually get that relevant content. You can get hours, you can get dates and times, you can get all sorts of things. So this turns into micro format, so it's indexable in Google, and then other people can see it, and they can just comment on that post and say they're going, and RSVP, and it shows up. We built this because we really missed upcoming.org, and somebody has to redo something to make a friendly event site like that. So why do we need an IndieWeb? First, if you're storing your photos and files somewhere else, you really need to have a user interface to browse through them. If your account was frozen during due to a violation of terms of service, like my Flickr account has 18,000 photos on it. Most of them are in violation of terms of service because they contain copyright content and links back to the original information, because I use it as research instead of original photos. So they could shut it down at any time. So I lived in relative fear for 2 years until we made kind of a copy of Flickr hosted on my own server. And then I could just go to photos.caseorganic.com. All my photos were there, same permissions, everything. And I now know that it's safe. Again, it's basically a cron job that runs, gets new photos, posted to my server. It's like, whew. Another reason is lost content due to a company getting acquired. And also the ability to just create again. I think after a while, the people who created stuff all the time are going to have issues with kind of the atrophy of the ability to create, because it's so much easier to just click on news articles. And this is a big issue, and people laugh about like addiction to the internet, but it's a hidden thing. Like if you think about hoarders in the real world, how they have lots of newspapers and cats, and sometimes they can even die because there's so many cats and newspapers in their house, and like the newspapers fall on them, and they have all these episodes about that with television shows. If you think about that on your computer, like what's in your phone, you can put lots of data into your phone, but it doesn't get any heavier. And so if you open up somebody's phone, it's full of news articles and pictures of cats, probably. And so we're kind of doing the same thing. You just don't notice it. It's very invisible if somebody's addicted to the internet, versus it's very noticeable if you're addicted to hoarding.
Bookmarking sites.
Bookmarking sites, yes. There's a clone of a bookmarking site that you can install on your own server to hoard stuff on your server if you because Delicious got shut down, and then guys bought it and they're like, hey, we want to bring back the old Delicious, and of course they didn't. They changed the user interface, and it's like, oh, that's dumb. So also freedom, this is really important. When I started posting stuff on my own web domain again, I felt really fantastic, and I felt like I had freedom again. It was it's different. It's like owning a piece of property or a piece of land that you can do anything you want with no restrictions. It feels really good. Physiologically, it feels really good. Mentally, it feels great. So I would suggest it just for this alone. Also, you can be like Braveheart, I guess. You could paint your face while you're like on. Basically, the freedom to decide whatever the heck you want on your web domain. If you don't like the user interface, you can change it, and you could host notes or data on your own site forever and have it backed up. And if you want to know more, you can go to IndieWebCamp.com/y. This is hosted on my own domain, and these are all just HTML slides, so you can get to all this stuff. So, like the origins of America, where people could go homestead and make land into what they wanted, you should really be homesteading instead of sharecropping if you want to create the next web, and if you want to have the freedom to build something and be creative and feel really good about what you're doing. And it's a really great way to self-express. And also, you can have hyperlinks across the open web instead of internally in these third parties. So they're much longer lasting, and it just gives the web back its richness because you don't have to log in to see where something links. So what the community has built. So the IndieWeb Camp community has built a bunch of open source components. Of course, there's no one right answer. Whatever components get used the most win over time, but there's always going to be alternatives. It's very emergent, and you can roll your own experience out of it. There's lots of documentation. You can do whatever you want. And it's totally okay to disagree in this community. Say, I disagree, here's a better way. Link to something I built. Yay, okay, oh, that is better, right? It's not a, oh, well, this is the right way, and it's just the exact opposite of a lot of like siloed VC-backed companies that say, well, this is the right way to do it, and you have to pay for this thing. So you don't get caught in the trap of where something is really beautiful for 3 years, and then it gets really lame after a while and becomes a zombie company. You just have this thing that everybody individually owns. So we've done a lot of stuff in PHP and Ruby and Python if you want to integrate WebMention into your site, and a bunch of microformats parsers, and a bunch of WordPress plugins. If you run your own site on WordPress, you can just play with it. And this is building blocks if you just search for that. So what you can do, really simple stuff. Own your domain if you don't already have one. You just go to any namecheap.com or something, get your name. And then you can join this IRC channel if you want. It's on Freenode. And there's just people there that'll be like, hey, cool, you're interested. And then you can come to IndieWeb Camp if you want. It's like this really wonderful thing to go there and have interesting people talk about interesting stuff and then build it right in front of you and have stuff built by the end of the day. There's really not a lot of theoretical stuff that goes on there. It's just, let's implement this piece, then let's implement this, and this. It's always small pieces. It's not, let's build this amazing thing. It's, let's build these little tiny things. And I think that's much better to parse things to have it really small. So what if we don't do this? Well, we stop creating. Say, well, there's only some people who can create, and it takes a really long time. So like on Reddit, somebody says, I built a giant igloo in my backyard in Canada, and it took him a long time, and we all just look at it instead of going out and building our own thing. So we need to really focus on this route, because if we don't, people are still going to take our data, sites will go away, and we'll have not really a lot of history. So show, don't tell if you want to contribute to anything. And may the best implementation do really well but not completely win, because diversity is very useful. This is my favorite quote. A designer knows he has achieved perfection not when there is nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. So when you build something, stop putting all these features in it. Just do the minimal thing that it takes and try to find a clever way to do something. We don't want to end up with more NASCAR problems, NASCAR effect problems. We want to end up with something where you take it down to the building blocks and get the actual core of the experience and figure out how to replicate that everywhere, instead of having everybody do the Me Too service and then having a big nightmare for everybody. So let's make a web that we can build on again, hopefully. And thank you for your time.